the common experience of life at every level, and by no means only the human level, tells us that worthwhile developments are always the result of reaching out for something better, and not of being swept along accidentally like unresisting pebbles in a mountain stream. Again, the fact that life is capable of evolving to higher levels of awareness means that life's highest potential is the central reality, of which the lower forms are as yet but imperfect manifestations. The greater the refinement of man's awareness, the more clearly he recognizes the quest for enjoyment as a search for inner divine joy. Thus, the basic human desire for happiness deserves to be recognized as the cornerstone of the loftiest moral vision. Backing off from man to consider again the totality of life, we find that the evidence points to a continuity and a harmony, not only in all life, but perhaps in the very universe. Everywhere on this planet, at least, we find a reaching upward, first towards greater awareness, then towards greater enjoyment of that awareness, and finally towards joy itself. This means then that evolution is more than a blind upward push from below, through the ceaseless threats from environment to the survival of a species. Evolution is also a process of reaching upward towards fulfillments yet to be achieved. Indeed, evolution deserves to be defined more in relation to the heights than to the depths. The very presence of life itself has been virtually a guarantee of development sooner or later. No conscious goal was required, no omniscient guide to blaze the evolutionary trail. Quite sufficient and far more marvelous, surely, has been the innate urge of life itself to experience, to explore, to understand, to enjoy, and ever more fully through self-expression to discover its own highest potential. The greatest artist is always the one who allows his creations, in a sense, to create themselves, to work out their own destinies without the imposition of his own predetermined ends and inclinations. If the human creator gives his creations so much latitude for self-expression, is it not impious to impute less sensitivity to the cosmic creator towards his universal handiwork? But again, if the highest achievements are already present as a potential, even at life's humblest beginnings, this means that the heights have not actually to be created, any more than energy has to be created for the downward swing of a pendulum. The heights of awareness must have existed from the beginning, and the forms of life that have evolved have been vehicles only for the increasing manifestation of consciousness, a consciousness which in itself has remained ever present and ever constant. In this sense, there has been no actual evolution, no progress, no process of becoming. There's been only a gradually increasing realization of the fullness of that which was from the beginning.
Think of the need. Think of the need in this world for a teaching that can give people what they all desperately want. I've taken on the big guns of Western thought. You look at them, all of them. But it's so obvious that what they've said is just completely out of whack with what the truths that Master brought. And when I saw this, I thought, well, gosh, if I see it, I have to say something. Nobody else has done it, I've got to do it. This is my philosophy. But that book is written, I know Stephanie Raffino Darmini wrote to me saying she'd been educated with so many doubts. She felt so desperate because everything was depressing. You read the philosophy of all these people, it's all ego-centered, competitive-centered, meaningless, purposeless. I know when I finished Crises in Modern Thought, I heard of Leon Kolb, who was an archaeologist and So I went to him because there was some little point that I thought was perhaps anomalous in this whole thing of Darwinian evolution. The whole idea of evolution is that it's all an accident. He got very emotional about this, that he would dare to challenge Darwin. He said, I'm a specialist in anthropology. He came from Romania. And so I said, look, I'm not going to argue with you, but I do ask you, please, read these 4 chapters on evolution. All right, I will read it. Well, here was the nice thing. I came back after 2 weeks. He'd read the things. He was so excited. He said, you haven't challenged what Darwin said at all, but you've put it in a new light and everything makes sense now. We must spread this truth everywhere. He was an old man, ready to die, but still he was that excited. I'm excited. These are things that we can bring to people. We can show them that it makes so much sense, completely the opposite of what our Western education has given us, which is all the cause in the world to be atheists, materialists, competitive, fighting each other, dog eat dog, and God knows what else. And if you come in with a beautiful philosophy, oh, it's all love, they say, what are you talking about? But you give them good, solid reasons, and like Leon Kolb, they say, wow, hey, this is true. This I want to do. I know that I'm not going to live much longer, and I hope it's not too much longer. You're not going to live that much longer. We're talking of a long wave. It's going to take much more than our lifetimes to change a lot of people. But these are truths, and those are falsehoods, and truth has to come in the end. More and more people understanding this will suddenly come to that dream that I had when I was a schoolboy. How can I inspire people? We can.
Well, I've been reading one of Swami's books. It's called Out of the Labyrinth. It was called Crises in Modern Thought years ago. And I'm going to read a little bit from it because I'm so inspired. And I'm also going to put in some part of a speech that Swami made upon finishing the book, because he took on what he called the great guns of Western civilization with the idea of creation and the theories of the scientists. And I'm not a speaker, but I know that when I see my daughter and son, young people today, thinking that there's no meaning in life, and from what I'm learning, mostly just by the feelings and the intuitions as I get into my meditations and into subtler and subtler energies, like magnetism and electricity, for example. There's subtler energies, way subtler than that you get into when you venture deeper and deeper into the stillness and open yourself up. So I wanted to do this reading and maybe say a few things first. I was thinking about when there's a creation, how the center is the reality. And you know, when you're skiing and you feel close to your center, just like a flywheel, at the center, if it spins, you're solid, you're in there. But the more to the outside you get, and the faster it spins, you'll fly off. And it's that orbit is so occurring in nature at every level. Like the atomic level, infinitesimally in small things, and at the planetary solar system galaxy level, the orbits, and in the level of your own self, north and south polarities that form when magnetism of orbits gets stronger and stronger towards a center. As I was saying, when you're skiing, and if you can click in and feel like you're really at your center, and if there's a mogul to the left or a mogul to the right, you're free to go either way, and you're balanced. Well, at that moment, you tap in to a whole panorama, a base, a big solid base that you can function from. And there's every possibility then. You're not restricted. You feel like you can do anything. And this vastness that you can tap into, all the great artists, the ones that are really great, and people like Einstein even, and all the geniuses have said that they, rather than thinking that they created something, they rather felt like they tapped into a resource that was there. And Yogananda, master, said a very interesting thing. He said that thoughts are not your own. You tap into them at whatever level you are. And getting back to this theme of magnetizing, if you've generated energy that has gotten closer and closer to the center and closer to that north polarization that has been forming, then you tap into, I talked of subtler and subtler intuitions and feelings. Well, you tap into the really fine electricities, or if you, for lack of a better word, and you can, by intuition, find what's in that realm, rather than going the other way in evolution down towards the South Pole, more or less where we've come from, where, you know, the next lower down was the animal, and that was more instinctual, and there was the sex drive there, and more sensual, more like the animals could hear and see really well, better than we can, because once we get up higher, we don't need those things. We want to unify. We want to tap into the one consciousness. And Swami once said to somebody that was an atheist that try and imagine God as the highest potential in you, the highest potential in yourself. And that highest potential would be tapping in to the vast resource. And if you think of creation as being an absolute, and in order for something to be created, it had to be expressed out of that one. Well, then comes relativity. It's not absolute in the idea that it's dreamed something, it's expressed something, and now there's a polarity, there's a back and forth, there's a pendulum swing, and cold, hot, hate, love, dualities of every kind, on every level, enter. But the great sages and saints have said that you can tap into the whole. If you're a wave on the ocean, you can tap in to the ocean deep. So in other words, the wave is not the ocean, but the ocean is the waves. It encompasses the waves. But they're only superficial. So we see each other and we see different things as separate. But at the core, at the center, it's that vast knowledge. It's that vast oneness from which everything came. Now, you think of planetary systems and solar systems, galaxies in an orbit. Sure, we have our solar system orbiting around the sun, but now that sun is out there orbiting around something. And it supposedly is a dual sun system that it's orbiting around. And many thousands of years it takes for the orbit to complete itself. But just as in everything else, like the flywheel, when it's farthest away from its center is a dark age. And supposedly Jesus came in a dark age, and then it's like seasons. It's not linear like Aristotelian thinking. I guess it originated with Aristotle. Linear thinking was not right. It's more like seasons. Spring into summer, fall into winter, and back. And back around. So when these galaxies, solar systems, whatever the entity may be, gets closest to its center, there's that magnetism, and the subtle energies are real strong. And you can perceive much better. You're closest to the source, just like in skiing, what I said, being closest to the center. You've got that panorama. You've got the power, you can go anywhere. Well, if the solar system is closest to that center, then it's a higher age. And man can see things that he can annihilate time and space, really. And his ego isn't, he's risen above that. It's important to help you to grow and to reason, but the ego is, it's a differentiated thing, and we're all unitive. So in the high ages, you wouldn't need the ego either so much, because you are sensing you're part of the oneness of all that is, of creation, of God. And so there are teachings that have come from those higher ages. We wonder how different things were built on this earth, and when we find remnants. And we wonder how great scriptures like the Upanishads and the Vedas were written. And the biblical scriptures, well, some of those old Indian scriptures were written. Well, they didn't need to be written, but they were from the higher ages, passed down. And the interesting thing is that everything that Jesus said and knew was perfectly aligned with those truths. I mean, he said he came to fulfill the scriptures, and everything he said was truthfully, perfectly in line with other scriptures that were from higher ages. So we are in the age of energy. We've come up from a low age, like the age when Jesus was here, was very material. But in our age, it's more an age of energy. It's the second of what people could call 4 ages, the fourth being really high, closest to the center of the orbit. But we're in the age of energy, and we have found out things. The science has been our great friend, finding out some of these truths, that matter is different densities of vibration. And even they're starting to say that the vibrations are starting to look like mind stuff, for lack of a better word. Mind stuff. And sure, it's vortices. There we are with our orbiting and magnetisms being generated. Vortices of energy, because the magnetism pulls things into a whirlpool, pulls things together. That's how matter forms, and that's how thought forms are brought together, and much gets developed in the world that way. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." But the way the masters talk, it's more, "I am, therefore I can think." Because if I'm conscious, wouldn't I be getting that source from consciousness? Wouldn't God be consciousness? And with that thought comes liberation. A creation would express out of that vast consciousness, and would first be more the thought forms, like the Bible said, the Word. And then it would become more projected out into material things. So it's more like from ether, nebulous gases, into liquids and solids. From man's potential with our thinking, intuitive frontal lobe that we have, to the animals, down to the plants, and then finally, the amoeba, paramecium, and into the rocks would be the lowest awareness, the most dull. And it moves progressively up from that. If you think of it as the Big Bang, from the very end, coming back, a rock gets progressed over eons of time, and animals are formed. It's in a momentum to progress. So animals' instincts get finer, and their survival, their curiosities grow, their awareness grows, and by the time you're human, you're starting to not need those keen instincts, because you're starting to see that they're just waves on the ocean. The ocean is what you want to tap into. So you can't see as well as the animals are here, but you are starting to see things unitively instead of being separate. And like Yogananda said, your thoughts are not your own. Thoughts are universally and not individually rooted. So the person, once you're, up above the primitive levels, and you're starting to think not what's in it for me so much as, but everybody is part of me. We're all part of this projection, and so the distinctions start to fade a little bit. That's when you're getting out of the merchant mentality, what's in it for me, into maybe the warrior mentality of, like, I would die for my people. And then the more unitive you feel, you're getting into the attitude more like a sage or a priest or the Pope or a saint, who would say, I do this for my brother who is part of me. I move my hand, and God is my hand. So we are seeing things more unitively at the higher stages And we don't need our ego so much anymore. The thing that helped us to plot our path and progress, we need rather to just think more expansively and not of our own little self. So at that stage, we're not progressing in evolution like automatically, like the rocks into the plants, into the animals, etc. We're becoming a cause instead of an effect. But we can sink back down if we do make that power and draw it unto ourselves. We can whip up this energy, but we've got to project it up into awareness, not down. Otherwise we can regress instead of progress. And in this age, science has been a great help. But there's one drawback to the way the majority of people think, scientists and in religion, and that is they're still trying to reason. And when you think of the vastness that you can tap into, and you put reasoning in there, it's kind of like putting static, something, a differentiated thing. When you're trying to tune in, you got that static. Well, you get rid of the reason, and there it is, intuition. That's when you're accessing levels where the thoughts automatically come, and it's the right thought. It's natural. It's nature. It has the right destiny. It knows what it's doing. It's the creator. So we want to merge back into that. Jesus said nobody ascended up to heaven except those who first descended down into here. We've come from that one unitive, expansive place. We've come into particular things, bodies, and with our abilities and capabilities now, Jesus said, ye are gods. And he came to show us that we are that. What I have done, you can do also, he said. He didn't come to show how great he was and that we could never attain that, and that we're our base realities. He came to show us that the way he overcame, we can also overcome and sit at the right hand of the Father. We can also overcome when you think of a painter and the potential of what he's going to paint. Well, society makes us think if we're sinners and we're base people, that we're that blob of paint, and we keep being drawn back down to that. It's not so. Here we are, we're on the brush stroke, and we're starting a painting. We're not thinking the blob, we're thinking the potential of what that painting's going to be. And Swami said the pendulum, when it's at its perfectly rested center, then duality, creation, would be when it starts to be a pendulum. But the potential is already there for the down, and then it starts to flicker back and forth. That energy is already a potential. When we are in our lower selves thinking of greed and lust and regret, we've already got the potential to reach higher and think of higher things. Getting back to this orbiting in the spine and reason versus intuition, if we can bring our energy up. Geniuses are people of high energy. Saints are people of high energy. You can imagine there are practices that get the energy going higher to here. That's where your frontal lobe has facilitated great expansion. And when we intensify that magnetism and focus higher, then you automatically see that reason is of no use. That up in this region there are answers, not questions. Questions are differentiated things. The great saints, you wonder about the miracles, how they can be here or there, bring people to life, and make water into wine, or levitate, or Master used to be able to sit with doctors and use the lingo of doctors, or draw an oil painting, and he had taken no instruction, or they can play instruments, or they can learn languages, and they're tapping into that because there's no thwarting cross currents in their magnet they've developed. The molecules are all pointing in a north-south direction because they have, through intense self-study, gotten into those vortices that were holding energy unto itself, desires, and blasted through that. No, I don't need that. No, I don't need that. Years of intense self-study has cleared the way for intuition. Just beautiful, clear intuition. And they can tap into truth from the vast expanse of all that is. So when you can see other people and know, just like you know that under an island and another island in the mainland, you know that if you could see beneath the water, it's all connected. There's a big ground underneath there. And we're just all projections out of that big ground. So when you can see that everything else is part of us, and you start to feel, because you're meditating and your magnetism's getting stronger, and you're starting to get results, like when you do something for that person instead of keeping it for yourself, and you felt good. And then if you don't project that feeling, that joy, or if it's sorrow that something went wrong, if you don't project it out to the thing, oh, that thing made me mess up, or that person made me mad, or oh, that is so beautiful, it made me happy. If you can not project outwards to those things aren't making you happy, those things aren't hurting you. Everything is neutral. It's your reactive process. Desires that are thwarted, get rid of the desires. Get rid of the reactive process. Then it's in the center again, what we were talking about. And when you do something to help someone else, hold that energy in. It's at your center. It's your tapping into the whole vast expanse that's fulfilling you, that is you. Well, I didn't mean to talk so much, but I'm practicing, trying to understand these things, and it helps to speak. It helps to talk about them, because then you're not just an armchair philosopher, you're actually trying out some of the concepts that you're tapping into And I might put some of this on the internet, but I do want to put the reading that Swami wrote into his book, Out of the Labyrinth. And if I get some responses from people, from you all, I'll read some more to you. As I said, I have a daughter and son that are in their late teens, early 20s, and I see the kids. You guys are out there. It's a scary world, and I have felt so much peace with what I'm learning. And it goes so against what some of the religions say and science. Science, it's pretty close to what science is saying. But yet scientists sometimes are using a little too much mechanistic reasoning, as we were talking about. So, maybe if you get something out of what I'm saying, or what I'm reading, or look at some of the other videos I've put up about Swami Kriyananda and Yogananda, Jesus, if you are enjoying some of that, if it's touching, if it's resonating in you, you're feeling like, wow, something is making sense here. It doesn't matter what other people are thinking or doing. You find your own joy, because joy, that inner joy, is that magnetism, that energy that has no limit. That's when you're tapping in to the infinite. This is a reading from Out of the Labyrinth by Swami Kriyananda. Meaning in Evolution, Part 4. Is evolution progressive? Page 217 near the bottom. Certain levels of self-understanding do make possible the only insights we ever receive into other people. It is by our liking something, like ice cream, that we can appreciate what motivates others when they struggle to acquire other things, even when their likes or dislikes differ widely from our own. It seems reasonable to suppose that the same holds true for life generally. The fact that you and I like to walk gives us no good reason to assume that the snails grumble at being legless, but it may help us to appreciate something of their need for movement. There are levels, in other words, on which we and they, and probably all other creatures, share a common bond. Life, for example, and the wish to perpetuate one's own life. One of the basic facts of existence is the struggle for survival. Living organisms are engaged in a ceaseless battle to eat and to keep from being eaten. Why? Why this consummate eagerness to remain alive? Is it only mechanistic? A sort of inertia that, having once been set into motion, must continue till it's brought forcibly to a standstill? Yet, even if such be the case, what we find here is no merely mechanical operation of Newton's law, but illustrates rather a link between physical mechanics and some higher principle. For obviously there's some sort of will in the organism itself to perpetuate its existence. The question again, why? Surely the reason is quite simply that the animal's existence is in some way meaningful and worthwhile to itself. We use these words meaningful and worthwhile loosely for lack of better expressions. But if there is a struggle for survival, It can only be to perpetuate existence as a conscious experience and not as a mindless fact. Conscious experience, then, not survival, is the key to progressive evolution. Survival alone would merely preserve the status quo. It's a static consideration. The will to experience, however, is expansive. It denotes a purposive urge, however vague or undirected. Animals do not rest satisfied with the mere continuation of their experience of life by surviving. It seems clear that they also do their best to broaden that experience. That the will to experience is an active force at every level of life may be seen from the fact that living organisms do so much more than struggle to survive. Why does a monkey take a bite out of one fruit, then throw the perfectly good remainder away and reach for another fruit? Merely to survive? The first fruit would have suited its survival needs perfectly well. The only explanation that makes sense is that the monkey wanted to experience the taste of something else. Why did an ancient fish with rudimentary legs make sallies onto the shore? Only because its legless relatives wouldn't let it eat in the water with respectable folks? More likely, the adventurous fish was impelled by a degree of curiosity, dim perhaps, but actual. It could eat where it normally lived, but wanted to find out what the food tasted like somewhere else. For if sufficient food for survival were the only goal of a fish's existence, many an otherwise energetic fish need hardly move at all. Why, in far-off times, did a primitive land animal with rudimentary wings try to use those appendages for flight? Only to escape some predator, or perhaps to get at food that it couldn't reach otherwise? Possibly. Yet very possibly also, judging from the behavior we see in life all around us, it enjoyed the sensation of letting the wind lift a little of the weight off of its legs. In breeding, it would have been inclined to mate with others of similar buoyant spirits. Thus, one presumes, a process of natural selection was begun that resulted finally in the bird kingdom. And why does a chicken cross the road? Ask any child that riddle and you'll get your answer, because it wants to get to the other side. Watching animals in their natural habitat, it's obvious that a great many of their movements are directed by the sheer delight at being able to leap, jump, fly, and even tease one another. And here's another evolutional puzzle. How to explain, except in terms of a desire for a greater awareness, the paradox of the size of man's brain? This question has long been a puzzle to biologists. From a standpoint of competition and survival alone, a very slight increase of intelligence over that of other animals would be quite enough to keep mankind alive and prowling the plains. Man's brain, however, relative to his body size, is about 3 times as large as that of the next most intelligent land animal. Why? Surely it's man's desire for experience and not merely for survival that sets him so radically apart in this important respect. The researcher, Simpson himself, points out that the struggle for survival is by no means the only factor active in evolution. The process, according to Simpson, is rather one of progressive adaptation to environment, in which the struggle for survival plays only one role, albeit an important one. But the question is not even merely one of adaptation. Water will mold itself submissively to the contours of its basin. Living organisms are not so acquiescent. An animal would crawl out of its basin, food or no food, comfort or no comfort, to see what lies on the other side of that nearby hill. Clearly, evolution does represent more than change. In terms of life's own deepest and most instinctive drive, there is a trend toward ever more expansive, more dynamic awareness. The fish-like creature with stubby legs that comes out onto dry land not only begins a new evolutional trend towards lungs and legs, it also places a certain premium on curiosity. Its curiosity, moreover, and that of its fellow adventurers with whom it mixes, tends to evolve a species in which curiosity and the capacity for the satisfaction of that curiosity will be just a little bit more pronounced. The newly spotted leopard, by using its spots to the best advantage, is not only learning to be crafty personally, it's also directing evolution towards greater cunning and eventually towards greater intelligence. The successful leopards, evolutionally speaking, will be those making the most creative use of their natural spotty endowment. In the simpler life forms, as the abilities to see, hear, and feel are developed, an evolutional premium is placed again on awareness. It seems safe to say that in the lower animals, this trend expresses itself only vaguely beyond the simple desire to continue living. Evolution at those levels is less clearly motivated because life at those levels is still so imperfectly aware. In the higher animals, however, motivation becomes clarified as a desire, not merely for a continuation of life, but for an expansion of awareness, and in the expansion, for the enjoyment of life. In mankind, evolution no longer requires new life forms through which to continue life's expansive urge. For man, in his present form, is capable of a vast expansion of awareness, from almost animalistic dullness to the highest levels of genius, indeed, to the highest spiritual attainments, such as those of a Buddha or a Jesus Christ. The more expanded the awareness of a human being, the more he comes to see enjoyment as an abstraction and not limited, therefore, to things or to specific experiences, as something rather that can be pursued for its own sake. Man at the lowest level of human evolution, a person, that is to say, whose awareness is dim and confined to his own self-interest, equates fulfillment with sensual pleasures. At higher levels of human evolution, however, with the appearance of a keener and more expanded awareness, there arises naturally in human nature a subtler understanding of fulfillment, less sensual and more mental and spiritual. Abstract thoughts at higher levels of human evolution can be intensely satisfying, as can inspiration and intangible feelings such as peace, happiness, and selfless love. Lofty sentiments are appreciated as far more enjoyable than a good meal. Expansive insights into the nature of reality, high ideals, and spiritual faith become things for which refined human beings would give up any pleasure, even to sacrificing their own lives. The greater the refinement of man's awareness, the more clearly he recognizes the quest for enjoyment as a search for inner divine joy. Thus, the basic human desire for happiness deserves to be recognized as the cornerstone of the loftiest moral vision. Backing off from man to consider again the totality of life, we find that the evidence points to a continuity and a harmony, not only in all life, but perhaps in the very universe. Everywhere on this planet, at least, we find a reaching upward, first towards greater awareness, then towards greater enjoyment of that awareness, and finally towards joy itself. This means then that evolution is more than a blind upward push from below, through the ceaseless threats from environment to the survival of a species. Evolution is also a process of reaching upward towards fulfillments yet to be achieved. Indeed, evolution deserves to be defined more in relation to the heights than to the depths. Orthodox thinking so far, almost as much so in religion as in science, has viewed mankind, to say nothing of the lower forms of life, almost wholly in relation to the depths. In religion, the emphasis has been on original sin. In physics and chemistry, it's been on the material origins of life. In biology, it's been on the gradual change from lower life forms as a result of the struggle for survival. In psychology, it's been on defining man in terms of his more physical drives, which are merely suppressed when he tries to live by lofty ideals. always the emphasis has been on the lower, as though it, and not man's aspirations, were the basic reality. If the force behind life and evolution were nothing but a struggle for procreation and survival, a blind push upwards from below, then certainly we ought to acknowledge this reality humbly, lest we cut ourselves off from the very wellspring of our existence. To deny our primordial urges would mean to weaken any chances we might have for further development. If, however, the creative force behind evolution has been a search for experience and for expanding awareness and enjoyment, then it is forward with aspiration and not backward with fear or depreciation that man must look for further guidance on the evolutional path. In fact, the common experience of life at every level, and by no means only the human level, tells us that worthwhile developments are always the result of reaching out for something better, and not of being swept along accidentally like unresisting pebbles in a mountain stream. Again, the fact that life is capable of evolving to higher levels of awareness means that life's highest potential is the central reality, of which the lower forms are as yet but imperfect manifestations. The lowest life forms may be compared, in other words, to the first tentative brushstrokes on a vast, uncompleted canvas. Science speaks of potential energy. This is what is present in a pendulum, for instance, at the top of its swing. Though the pendulum is momentarily motionless, it contains all the energy potential for its downward movement. Life, similarly, contains in its humblest beginnings all the potential for its highest future development, a potential presumably far greater than that realized by mankind up to this present time. Life must gradually, of its own nature, find its way to higher and higher manifestations of awareness. In the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, Krishna, symbolic of the divine consciousness in man, agrees to remain at Arjuna's side during the war of Kurukshetra. He does so, however, with the stipulation that he will only serve as Arjuna's charioteer and take no active part in the conflict. Arjuna is pleased with the arrangement, for he is convinced that with the Lord by his side, whether or not actively intervening, victory will be assured. This allegory might well be applied to organic evolution. Certainly there's no overt sign of divine intervention evident in the long, tortuous, and apparently haphazard process of natural selection. And yet, the very presence of life itself has been virtually a guarantee of development sooner or later. No conscious goal was required, no omniscient guide to blaze the evolutionary trail. Quite sufficient and far more marvelous, surely, has been the innate urge of life itself to experience, to explore, to understand, to enjoy, and ever more fully through self-expression to discover its own highest potential. The greatest artist is always the one who allows his creations, in a sense, to create themselves, to work out their own destinies without the imposition of his own predetermined ends and inclinations. If the human creator gives his creations so much latitude for self-expression, is it not impious to impute less sensitivity to the cosmic creator towards his universal handiwork? But again, if the highest achievements are already present as a potential, even at life's humblest beginnings, this means that the heights have not actually to be created, any more than energy has to be created for the downward swing of a pendulum. The heights of awareness must have existed from the beginning, and the forms of life that have evolved have been vehicles only for the increasing manifestation of consciousness, a consciousness which in itself has remained ever present and ever constant. In this sense, there has been no actual evolution, no progress, no process of becoming. There's been only a gradually increasing realization of the fullness of that which was from the beginning. A speculative question, perhaps, in the present context, but certainly a most challenging one. The vital question remains, what are we? What is man? Chapter 13, In Search of an Absolute. In the expansion of awareness, we've discerned a universal criterion of progress. Given awareness as a yardstick, one cannot help wondering where the limits lie. At its highest observable levels, we see a shift away from definitions and toward a more unitive vision. Might total awareness, then, entail the disappearance of distinctions and relativities altogether, resulting in a state of consciousness that is absolute? Chapter 13, In Search of an Absolute. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. Max Planck. The great sage Paramahansa Yogananda was once asked, "Is there any end to evolution?" "No end," he replied. "You go on until you achieve endlessness." What are we? What is man? And we will continue. Thank you.
When God created the universe, we could liken God, as Master did, to an ocean. And when God chose to create, he put his consciousness into movement and began thinking. And those thoughts created the causal universe, put them into further movement, or I should say those movements created their own sub-movements, as waves have many ripples upon their surface too. So those thoughts began to become energetic by becoming more restless, and so it created the astral universe. And then that astral energy began to take on the appearance in the complexity of all these waves of being something totally divorced from the base of it, the source of it, and it took on an appearance of a solid reality of its own, which is this world. An appearance without energy, without consciousness, as if it were completely mindless. But all of these movements really originate from that still, calm center of the ocean. So when God created, we could say that he created these waves. You don't change the level of an ocean by creating waves. You can't make the level of the ocean higher by pushing the waves higher, because every time you've got a wave, you've got a corresponding trough. Now, these ups and downs in creation, the whole principle of creation is Dvaita, duality. Everything is created in duality. And you can't have one without its opposite. You can't have positive without negative. You can't have joy without sorrow. Love in an emotional way without hatred. Joy in an emotional way without sorrow. Heat and cold and pleasure and pain and so on. We're talking of outward realities, because the joy of God's own existence, the joy is not a reaction to, oh, how wonderful this thing is, a joy that doesn't move outward, but that just rests in itself. This does not have its opposite. God has absolute love, absolute joy, but it's centered in himself, it's in the calm ocean, and there are no opposites to that. But as soon as you get an emotional kind of outward movement of energy, then you've got the beginnings of delusion. This happens with us individually. It happened with God. Not that God is in delusion, but he had to create delusion in order to give an appearance of reality to something that, of course, is not real, because everything really is just God. There isn't anything but God. So when God brought all this universe into manifestation out of himself, it too could be said to be a kind of emotion. It was motion, and emotion, I would say, could be taken to be movement outward, reaction to something outside yourself. And this movement outward from himself is essentially what we do when we respond to the world outside ourselves. When God draws everything back into himself, he brings all that motion back to a center, and everything merges back into consciousness. In another way, we can say that every one of us, individually, is the center of the universe, because everything that we'll ever understand about the universe begins with where we are. We can't understand the universe clearly in relation to somebody or some other thing. That's really why the approach of yoga is so much greater to the higher realities than the approach of science, because science is always out here. It's always working with instruments. It's got telescopes or microscopes or charts or mathematical formulae or whatever. It's always there, and that's its center. Whereas the real center that even the scientist has to work with is his own consciousness and his own ability to understand what he sees in a microscope. So science, in working out here, has created, is working on the periphery of his understanding. If a scientist could get to his own center as a yogi does, then he would be able to see things more clearly. You see, science says that because we are subjective as human beings, we want to get ourselves out of the picture. But we can never get ourselves out of the picture. Science, with all its effort, fails to do so. Most people think that they just have or haven't energy, that a person is a person of high energy or is not. But the truth is that we all have locked up within us the potential for the greatest possible energy in the universe. We have locked up within us the potential to somehow offer this little bit of consciousness, this little seed soul, into the infinite, to grow like a mustard seed and spread out to infinity. We have all the power of the universe locked up within us. Master used to say that in 1 little gram of flesh there is enough latent energy to keep the city of Chicago in electricity for a week. And yet we go around saying that we are weak because we don't have willpower. That's part of it. But on the other hand, the other part of it is that our energy, our willpower, is working against itself. We want conflicting things, and we have committed ourselves to things that we don't even remember that we've committed ourselves to. And yet in the subconscious mind, that memory is there. People under hypnosis, which incidentally I don't recommend because it has a debilitating effect on the willpower. But I'm not going into that discussion now. I'm just saying that so that you not think, well, because he talked of hypnosis, therefore let's try it. But people under hypnosis, it's very interesting how they have been made to relive something that they've forgotten altogether. And they've actually gone into hysterics, paroxysms of grief, they've just been overwhelmed. You can see that that energy that they had forgotten all about is still there. There's a very deep-seated complex that may be holding them back from further progress, some deep-seated disappointment to which they had given a lot of energy, and that energy isn't yet released. And there are many, many such things in our subconscious, not all of them that traumatic, but when you add them up numerically, they come to such a huge amount of commitment of our potential energy that it's no wonder that we have little energy to wake up in the morning, little energy to accomplish the things that we set out to accomplish in life. Being around high energy people, being in high energy places, these things too are very helpful. Kundalini represents the furthest pole of our outward moving energy. There's a very interesting corollary between that energy and the cycle of the solar system in the yugas that Sri Yukteswar explained it. He said that in the center of our galaxy there is a grand central sun, and that our sun has a dual. And as we rotate around that dual, it's interesting that a year or two ago there was something in the papers about astronomers suspecting that we may have a dual, because only in this way would it explain eccentricities in the orbits of the outer planets. But anyway, Sri Yukteswar stated this as a fact, and it's interesting that other things that he stated as a fact were unknown at that time and have since been found to be so, such as the location of the center of the galaxy, the fact that we're moving toward it, and the fact that matter is energy, and so on. As our sun rotates around its dual, as it approaches the center of this galaxy, we're way out on the outskirts. It isn't that we get very close to the center even then, but as we come closer to that center, the rays of energy from that center are stronger and stronger until we reach an apex at the closest point. As we recede, those rays of energy that reach us are weaker and weaker until at the farthest point we are in the darkest age. This age was reached in 500 AD, or more exactly 499 AD, when our solar system reached the farthest point away from the center of the galaxy, and now we are starting to move toward that center again. So we have these two poles in the movement of the solar system too. The pole that is closest to the center of the galaxy, the highest pole spiritually, and then that which is farthest away and completely locked in the sense of matter. In Kali Yuga, in the darkest age, mankind can only think in terms of matter. He can't imagine that this world is made of energy. He can't imagine energy, in fact. All he thinks about, except a few very unusual people, the average man is incapable of understanding anything except in terms of solid matter, fixed dogmas, rigid institutions. Everything is crystallized, everything is form, everything expresses the lowest quality of divine manifestation, which is matter itself. In the human body we find a similar situation, that there is going out from the medulla, the grand central sun of the body is the spiritual eye. And from the medulla, going out, we have, this is the anatomy of the spiritual body, we have the sympathetic nervous system, these two currents which you find in the anatomy of the body, the physical anatomy, but they have their spiritual counterparts too in the astral body. And these things go out from the medulla and unite at the base of the spine. At the base of the spine is the lowest quality of our consciousness, representing the earth element. Mind you, when they speak of elements, they mean elemental stages of manifestation. They're not talking of oxygen and hydrogen and so on. Those are elements of chemistry, but elements of divine manifestation, which is what the old traditions were speaking of when they spoke of air and ether and fire and water and earth as the basic elements. What they meant was that the subtlety of spirit manifests itself more and more grossly through ether and gases and the fiery state and then the molten state and finally solid matter. We see this in the galaxies, the spiral nebulae, which first are gaseous and then gradually they coalesce as they become more dense and become fiery stars, and then matter cools down to the point where it is molten, and then finally it cools to the point where it becomes solid earth and rock and all the differentiations that we see around us. But this earth element manifested in the body is represented by the lowest chakra, the lowest center in the spine, and this is called the earth chakra because it represents that movement away from our freedom in spirit into total bondage to matter. Sri Yukteswar described the ancient system of yugas or ages in India as being a much smaller time span than is normally thought of, and that these ages take place within, we've come in present history out of the dark age of Kali Yuga into the next age of Dwapara. Definitions of Dwapara, of going into this higher age, are several. One is that people live longer. Another is that they are taller. A third is that they are conscious of matter as energy and not just as physical matter. Kali Yuga is only 1200 years long, and Dwapara will be 24. And then there are two more ages. One, this age is the age of atomic energy, of demolishing space, of recognizing that matter is energy. And then the next phase, the next age, is Treta Yuga, which is an age of recognizing that energy too is only a manifestation of ideas, of consciousness, and mankind will be able much more easily then to, and much more normally, to communicate by telepathy. And then that age is 3600 years, and the next one is 4800 years, the golden age of spiritual enlightenment, where most people are aware of their souls and their relationship with God. Anyway, we have come since nearly 300 years ago into this age known as Dwapara. And in this century, suddenly man has become aware of energy. Man has become aware that matter isn't real, except as a manifestation of energy. The old concepts of matter, there was a scientist in the 19th century who, complaining at many of the theories of newer scientists, was saying, if you can't show me a model of it, I can't understand it. That's Kali Yuga thinking. That's thinking that everything is form, everything is solid, everything is crystallized. And Kali Yuga, seeing matter as the ultimate reality, can't think in fluid terms, can't think in terms of the spirit behind the organization, the essence of truth behind the dogma, and so on. It lives by rigid rules, rigid dogmas, rigid structures. Everything in Kali Yuga is limited by this consciousness of form and matter. Now we've come into an age of energy, and everything that everywhere we turn, we see not only the obvious fruits of energy in terms of electronics and automobiles and so on, but much more than that. There's a whole consciousness of energy now. We hear it in the music that's being written.
Put a candle in the window for you. The glow is gentle, the message is true. In a world losing its way, candle burns, our power's in play. In the stillness of my heart I can feel a light to revive me, love that can heal. Passion in the words you said, spark of hope has started to spread. And flames that are dancing, yellow, red, and blue, they burn with such a beautiful glow. But something's really alive about the fire I feel for you. It leaves the purest truth in my soul. Put a candle in the window for you, and in my darkest hour, your face shone through. Brighter every breath I take. They say there's no time, but I know there's a way.